Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock, editor-in-chief of pharmaphorum. Today's episode is sponsored by and produced in partnership with Novo Nordisk. In January 1922, 14-year-old Leonard Thompson, who was near death from diabetes in a Toronto hospital, became the first person in the world to receive a life-saving injection of insulin. A century later, scientists are still searching for new ways to improve this important medication. At the European Association for the Study of Diabetes meeting this week, Novo Nordisk presented promising data about a new form of insulin that could be delivered once a week rather than once a day to patients with type 2 diabetes. Here to discuss these findings and what they could mean for patients with diabetes is Florian Baeres, Corporate Vice President for Global Medical Affairs at Novo Nordisk. Hello, Florian. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at Novo Nordisk.
So my name is Florian Baeres. I'm a medical doctor by training and have worked with Novo Nordisk for 12 years by now. I've worked in different areas in global drug development, in global safety, and most recently in global medical affairs. And I also had the privilege of heading up this once-weekly insulin icodec project for almost 2 years. And I'm super excited to share a little bit more about the results and talk about them with you.
Great. Yeah, and I'm eager to talk about that as well. So this is data that was just published on a in development drug that you've been working on. And this would be the first insulin to be given on a weekly rather than a daily dose, right?
So I think there are several insulins under development that have the potential to be given once weekly. But yes, our compound has definitely been developed to be able to be given on a once weekly basis instead of a once daily basis.
So without getting too far into the weeds, talk to me a little bit about how that works in terms of the actual mechanisms. What was sort of the blocker there before and what needed to be done to make an insulin work that way?
So insulin has been around for over 100 years. So I think only last year we celebrated the discovery of insulin. And ever since then, we've been working on insulin molecules to make sure that it is as easy for patients as possible to take the insulin. So that went from multiple daily injections to once daily insulins. And now we're just at the advent of actually having once weekly insulins available. So you asked about how you do this. It's obviously has to do with half-life. So you make structural modification to the insulin backbone molecule, a technology we've also used for other of our medicines that actually allows us to prolong the half-life all the way so it can cover a full week.
Interesting. And so how long have you been working on this?
So drug development takes a long time, obviously. So it's more than 10 years. You start with molecular engineering, then you move into non-clinical research. You move to the first human dose, which is around 5-6 years ago that we started with that. Then you move into after first human dose, you move into phase 2. We use once weekly insulin in Novo Nordisk. So how do you give it? How do you make dose adjustments before you then can move on into the confirmatory trials, what we call the Onwards program, where we have a total of 6 trials the results of which will also base the foundation for regulatory submission.
So would you say we're in the home stretch now, or what's left, and what's the kind of percent chance this really comes to market at this point?
So I think we're definitely in the home stretch after all those years. And that's also why I'm so excited that we're talking about one of the studies that just was presented at one of the key diabetes congresses, the EASD. So we have a total of 6 Onwards trials that 5 of which that have already completed and top line levels have been shared already. And today we will discuss one of those trials that has been reported also at a scientific congress. So definitely the home stretch on a very long development journey.
So let's talk about that most recent study that was just published at EASD. What were we looking at in the study? What did the design look like, and what were we trying to learn? And what did the study show? What are the results that we're celebrating right now?
Thank you for asking. So Onwards 2 is one of the 6 trials in the Onwards program, and it investigates once weekly insulin icodec compared to a once daily insulin called degludec in a population with type 2 diabetes patients that already are on basal insulin. So the results of the study actually showed that if you treat them on equal grounds, the two insulins, that we would expect to see no difference in that. But we were actually surprised to see better glycemic control with our once weekly insulin icodec compared to the once daily insulin degludec. We've also seen that the rate of hypoglycemia, so the occurrence of low blood sugar values that actually affect the patients, were very low in both of these arms, with less than 1 event per person year of exposure, meaning that you actually need to be treated for more than a year on each of those insulin to have one of these events. While the rate of hypoglycemia in the icodec arm was higher than it was in insulin degludec, we also need to put a relevant clinical perspective on that. So if we combine how many patients achieved their glycemic targets without having a clinically relevant or severe episode of low blood sugar, we could actually see that 37% of the population achieved this goal with once weekly insulin icodec, as opposed to 27% with once weekly insulin degludec. So I personally think that these are quite intriguing data that we have shared today.
And if I can ask a follow-up, that difference of 27% to 37%, was that attributable to something like adherence, or is it really just a better performance of the drug itself?
I think it's a reflection of the once weekly sort of insulin that has been studied in this study. We haven't measured adherence from a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, but I think what we are really reassured about is to actually see that more patients achieve this clinical relevant end goal with our once weekly insulin icodec as opposed to once daily insulin degludec.
So insulin dosing is very complex, right? It's not like another medication where you might just take one pill every morning. You have to people with diabetes have to monitor their blood sugar. They have to administer their insulin accordingly. So how? Well, first of all, talk to me a little bit about how that works now, the status quo in insulin dosing and how it affects the patient experience. And then talk to me about, in trials and in your kind of how you envision the future, how this would work with the weekly dose instead.
So basal insulin still remains a cornerstone of care for management of diabetes. The current available basal insulin therapies are very much based on a once daily treatment regimen, meaning that over the course of a week, you will have to take 7 injections to cover your body's insulin needs. Whereas insulin icodec, that is being investigated here in this trial, has the potential to do all that in just 1 injection. It is my hope that this can significantly alleviate some of the treatment burden associated with basal insulin treatment by reducing these injections from 7 to 1 in a week.
Great.
And we know that a lot of people living with diabetes are apprehensive to both starting insulin therapy and also sometimes have challenges to adhere to the therapy. And we hope that once daily or once weekly insulin icodec will be able to address some of these concerns and ultimately make it easier for patients to take their insulin and also to stay on their insulins.
There's a few things there, right? There's needles, right? Needle phobia. I think most of us, even if we don't have a problem with needles, would rather inject ourselves once a week than once a day. But there's also an adherence thing there too, right? It's easier, there's less possibility for forgetting once a week rather than once a day. It's easier to work it into your schedule, right?
And it's great that you bring this up because I think so far there's no once weekly basal insulin out there. So we have very little experience. The best thing we can do is look at other drug classes like our GLP-1 receptor agonists, where you actually have data on once daily versus once weekly. And there we can actually, in some studies, see that the adherence that you just mentioned actually improves with a once weekly treatment compared to a once daily treatment.
Great. And I know it's not all public yet, but similar results from the other trials or the other studies in the Onwards series that you mentioned?
I think we have broadly consistent results, but we still need to take into account that some are done in different populations. So they are on different insulin regimens or they are in type 1 diabetes as opposed to type 2 diabetes. So obviously for this population, the results are not necessarily similar, but generally for this population, we've seen consistent results in the type 2 diabetes population, at least so far.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because I wanted to ask about type 1 and type 2. I mean, broadly looking into the future, is this something we think is going to be relevant for both those populations? And then on a similar note, are you testing in pediatric populations? I think, when you think about the sort of discomfort of daily versus weekly injections, I would imagine that we'd be looking to children with diabetes as a target population as well.
So currently our development program is only in the adult population. But I think I agree we also should strive to looking at development opportunities that could make this available to children over time. And that's something that we will also explore in the future.
Right.
I think with the two populations you mentioned, type 2 and type 1 diabetes, I think we need to appreciate that these are two different disease states, and the once weekly insulin dosing is probably primarily attractive to those with type 2 diabetes.
And why would that be?
I think because in type 2 diabetes, you have a disease state where you still produce some insulin yourself, and you have insulin resistant, meaning that the insulin that you produce doesn't work one-to-one at the receptor level. Whereas in type 1 diabetes, you have no insulin that you produce or very little you produce. You have to supplement it all externally, and you get the full effect at the insulin receptor. So for a once weekly insulin that is being given, it's probably easier to manage that treatment regimen in type 2 diabetes.
Right. So type 1 patients are the ones who are using things like continuous glucose monitors to manage their insulin at a very kind of granular level.
Some of them do. It's more prevalent in the type 1 diabetes population than it is in type 2 diabetes, but it's also gaining traction in type 2 diabetes.
Is a week the limit? In 10 more years, will we be talking about the once monthly insulin dose, or do we run against the limit in terms of that half-life you talked about?
Well, if you had asked me 100 years ago whether we would see a once weekly insulin, I'm not sure I would have said that would be what we would aim for. But I think, innovation is coming at different stages. We have currently no plans to move towards a once monthly insulin because there will also be some clinical sort of implication to that. But we remain committed to develop insulins that makes the treatment burden easier and sort of help ease the life of those living with diabetes.
So what about taking our lens back from the individual patient to the market more broadly? How could a weekly insulin affect things like access, price, and availability?
So I think we in Novo Nordisk are committed now that we bring a once weekly insulin forward in development now, hopefully also to the market, to make this as broadly as available as possible so patients can benefit from this innovation in basal insulin treatment.
I mean, what about things like storage and supply chain? Is there any effect on that? I know insulin is also a drug that needs to be kept at a certain temperature, and that can have issues too when we're thinking about global distribution.
I think the big opportunity you have with the once weekly injections only is that we will need fewer pens, just like we will need fewer injection. And it actually will provide us with an opportunity to reach our environmental goals by reducing both plastic and CO2 emission in the production of insulin icodec.
Is there anything else you guys are working on that are relevant to this?
I think, just as I said before, I think we remain committed to those living with diabetes. And I think we have a lot of early projects that both investigate insulins that might have the possibility to react to your glucose levels, which is quite interesting, but also continuously exploring partnerships and also whether we could help develop stem cell-based therapies that actually would avoid that you need to get insulin externally.
Yeah, so there's a ton of room for innovation here. And obviously, diabetes is even just type 2, but is a condition that affects a huge number of people worldwide. So the addressable market here and the potential for to help people and improve lives is pretty extensive.
Definitely. And I think, again, everything we can do as a sort of speaking as a scientist physician, to make sure that we improve the lives of those living with chronic diseases.
So I will wish you the best of luck as you continue to sort of shepherd this project to its conclusion through that home stretch that we talked about. Do you think there will be more trial results presented throughout the year, or what do we have to look forward to in terms of next steps?
Definitely, the next or the coming year is going to be super exciting, as we will make sure that we share more results than just sort of the company announcement that have been released at upcoming congresses throughout the year and going forward. So I hope I will be able to, over the course of the next year, to have even more data to share and to discuss with others.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Florian. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you for having me.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.